So what I'm going to talk about today is a new project, it's a project that has been funded by the FRIPRO program at the Norwegian Research Council, and a project under the title Riverine Rights, Exploring the Currents and Consequences of Legal Innovations. I'm only one of the project members of this project. The project is actually, it's led by my colleague Axel Borchgrevink at Oslo Met University. And we are part of a much larger team involving several people, involving anthropologists and lawyers and an economist and a sociologist, and stretching really between 3 different case countries, that is Colombia, India, and New Zealand. And so you can see here also on the right-hand side, then a list of the universities that are involved in this project. So it includes Universidad Latinoamericana in Medellin in Colombia, the Tata Institute for Social Studies in India, and also the law faculty at the University of Canterbury. And of all the people that are involved in the project, actually only one is actually really an expert on rivers, and that is Elizabeth McPherson, who is has worked on sort of issues around law and the law surrounding rivers for some time, and has actually fast become one of the international experts really on this topic of riverine rights. So what are we talking about when we're talking about riverine rights? Well, what we're talking about is really a wave of legal cases that have ended in rulings recognizing the rights of rivers. That is not rights to rivers. It's not really talking about the rights of human populations to rivers, but rather these rulings, interestingly, find in favor of the rights of the rivers themselves. And so what happened was that in around 2017, there started to be more and more of these cases taking off. And so we see actually this spreading really across the world, which became very clear to me observing this as a kind of a global pattern really that was taking place. And so what you see here is really a series of news articles from recent rulings taking place in different places around the world on the basis of the rights of rivers, or also considering also the rights of other natural entities in the world. So really what we're seeing here is a global trend. It's a global trend that really came up on my radar because of what had happened in Colombia. So since 2016, Colombian courts have issued rulings recognizing 18 distinct ecoregions as rights holders. 10 of these rights bearing ecosystems are river basins. And this also includes a ruling on the Colombian Amazon, on the Cocora Valley, and also on the Los Nevados Paramo. Paramos in Colombia are essentially these high areas of high biodiversity and high zones, which are also limited off as conservation areas. Similar legal cases and rulings can now also be found across the world in countries as diverse as India, and this includes rulings on the Ganges, Yamuna, and Narmada rivers, albeit that those rulings have now actually been suspended, but we can talk about that at another point in time. Also Bangladesh, with a recent ruling that all rivers in the country of Bangladesh are recognized as having their own rights. In the United States, there are cases. These have not ended in rulings, but there was a case surrounding the Colorado River. We see here also an article regarding the Mar Menor in Spain, and also including the Wanganea River in New Zealand. Of these cases, the Trato case in Colombia and the Wanganea River in New Zealand are the two most sort of well-cited cases that you would see in the international media. These cases are typically interpreted as concrete manifestations of a broader trend towards assigning legal rights to nature. As scientists, environmentalists, indigenous communities, and policymakers have started to recognize really the power of what can be called strategic litigation. That is really sort of class action suits or collective actions, legal actions, pushing for the recognition not only of their rights, but the rights of the rivers or these natural entities themselves. We're also seeing what has been called a global trend towards earth law being exemplified, commonly said to be exemplified by constitutional changes. So, for example, the constitutional recognition of the rights of nature in Bolivia and Ecuador, and also, interestingly, increasingly references being made as well to climate litigation cases, including the climate litigation case that's actually going on here in Norway. That this, although that case doesn't deal with recognizing the rights of the planet Earth, it does nonetheless, is nonetheless seen as being part of this kind of wave, this global trend towards what's called Earth law. So our project really attempts to really look more closely at what's going on with this, and particularly looks at three particular cases. And these are the most, well-known cases amongst this trend. So through the study of legal cases and their aftermath in 3 countries, Colombia, India, and New Zealand, we in our project, Riverine Rights, explore the implications of recent court rulings recognizing rivers as subjects or persons. And there are some legal distinctions made between whether they're recognized as subjects or persons. And in the project, we have 3 areas of concern. These include politics, broadly understood. Really, here we're looking at issues of broad political economy and also broad political ecology, where we're looking at the mechanisms that are established for enforcing rivers protection for different user groups. There are different models that have also been designed by the court rulings. I'll mention one of those models as I continue in this presentation as well. We're looking at issues around law as well, that is specifically the implications for existing legal frameworks and debates on the rights of nature. So what happens, for example, to human rights when we start also recognizing the rights of nature? This is one of the big issues, the big questions that we're looking at in the project. And we're also interested in the role of social theory, both as a driver of this trend, and also the implications of these court rulings for social theory as a possible testing of developments that are taking place within social theory. So we're looking then at the insights that these cases may offer for current debates about how to understand and govern the relationship between society and the natural world. So that's really what the project is doing in short. But I thought I'd just go on to talk about one case, just to basically exemplify a little bit more about these themes of politics, law, and social theory. So I wanted to then touch on this case, the case called the Etrato case, which is a case of a river in Colombia. This is really not only when we're talking about a river here, we're actually talking about a watershed of around 45,000 square kilometers in the north of Colombia. And here, of course, you can see a picture of the river itself on the right-hand side of the screen. So early in 2015, the human rights NGO Centro de Estudios para la Justicia Social, or the Center for Study of Social Justice, otherwise known also as Tierra Digna, initiated proceedings in the Constitutional Court of Colombia against the President of the Republic, the Ministry of the Environment, and also the Ministry for Sustainable Development concerning the Rio Etrato on behalf of the local indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peasant communities of the district of Chocó, or the region of Chocó, which is the region surrounding the river, the political district surrounding the river. The case was launched as an acción de tutela, that is, as a legal writ under Article 86 of the Colombian Constitution. This is recognizing really that anyone can launch a legal case on the basis that their rights, their constitutional rights, are being threatened. And so here the claim was being made that under Article 86, that the local population's interests, their rights, their constitutional rights were being damaged. And interestingly, they were being damaged specifically, as is stated in the case, specifically as a result of the government's failure to step in and do anything about illegal mining, that is the illegal dredging for gold along in the riverbanks and in the bottom of the river. So in its decision, the court found that the Colombian government had violated the fundamental constitutional rights alleged to have been breached by the river communities through its omission to control and eradicate illegal mining in the region. Significantly, the court recognized that the Rio Atrato, together with its basin and its tributaries, is, as they stated themselves, entidad sujeto de derechos, that is, an entity of subject rights. The 163-page decision of the court also made reference to the state of art in indigenous and environmental rights in Latin America and to specific international cases, including the Wanganui River in New Zealand. In this case, Tierra Digna, and the court determined that the Atrato River rights, as distinct from the community's human rights, are for its protection, conservation, maintenance, and restoration by the state and ethnic communities. So now you know a little bit about the case itself and its focus. Let's move on to just talk a little specifically about politics, law, and social theory. And so I'll just go very quickly through some issues that are really kind of relevant when thinking about this. And so what I want to talk, when I'm talking about politics, talk a little bit about a model for governance. That is the governance really of this rights of personhood. And then also talk a little bit about the complex political ecology in this region of the Chocó. And this image here on the right-hand side is very suggestive of that particular context, essentially, of armed actors operating in this part of Bolivia. So let's talk just a bit about the actual model for governance, first of all. So the ruling itself, this ruling 2622, part 16, it mandates the following: that it recognizes the Atrato's rights and established co-guardianship model and a panel of experts. This is meant to be made up of, in terms of co-guardianship model, made up of a selection of stakeholders from the local area, including stakeholders from the communities that had launched the case, that is from indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, but also from the broader community as well, together with a panel of experts being made up of local people, but also including academic experts, in fact, from local universities and from the Colombian Humboldt Institute as well. You can here see also that M5 to enact short, medium, and long-term plans to decontaminate and restore the Atrato. So it also has an aim then of actually not only ruling on the subject rights of the river, but also a process as well of improving the quality of the water and also protecting the river specifically. 6, to neutralize and eradicate illegal mining, and also note here, in 6 months' time. So that's a rather ambitious goal. 7, to develop and implement comprehensive plan to recuperate traditional livelihoods and subsistence models, again in 6 months. Again, an enormously ambitious and very obviously very difficult goal to try and carry out. 8, to design epidemiological and toxicological studies within 3 months, conducted within 9 months. And this is together with the experts, with the idea essentially of removing contamination from the river. And then the formation of a follow-up committee, and also M10 complying with the Ombudsman, the Human Rights Ombudsman's 2014 Resolution 064, which is essentially recognizing also the rights of the human population in this area of the country. So what we see here is the formation of a model of governance, a series as well of steps that have to be taken. But we also recognize here perhaps some of the complications already coming to the surface in terms of extremely ambitious timelines. And also the fact is that it's very clear here that the subject rights of the river are to be represented as well by human faces. And so we see here on the left-hand side here, the collection of the human faces that are essentially the series of stakeholders that represent the river, the Atrato River. We also recognize here that there is a very complex political ecology in this region. We're not only talking about a watershed that has an enormous scale in terms of being 45,000 square kilometers, but we're also looking at a region which is very complex in terms of its topography. And the fact the river runs from here, you can see the course of the river actually on the left-hand side, running from the Andean mountains through the lowlands of the Chocó all the way to the Caribbean city. It's actually one of the few rivers in Latin America that runs from south to north. So it's quite unusual in that regard also. We'll also see that this is a region which has also a lot of other complexities, including socioeconomic marginalization. This is actually one of the poorest regions of Colombia, a country that has a lot of regions where there are major socioeconomic difficulties. It's a region also, interestingly, with quite significant ethnic differences, where here we have around 98% of the population being either indigenous or Afro-descendant. Afro-descendant being essentially those communities that are descendants of African slaves that were transported to the Americas during the Spanish colonial period, and who have settled and have actually gained very much the same kind of recognition in terms of their rights to the indigenous population in the community by the Colombian state. But this is an interesting that it's 98% in this area, because then actually, generally speaking, in Colombia, it's only around 4% of the population that are indigenous, and around 12 to 14% that are Afro-descendant. So there's quite a high concentration then of these ethnic populations in this area of the Chocó. We also see very significant competing models of land ownership. We have small-scale farmers as well as large-scale industrial scale farming as well going on in this region. We see here also competing resource interests, and these include not only legal resource interests, including large-scale mining, but also illegal resource interests in the form of illegal kinds of mining. As I've said, the court case itself was launched on the basis of trying to deal with that, to respond to that particular problematic. We also have to recognize that the Colombian model really, in terms of its national model of economic development, is very much premised as well on large-scale resource extraction, the extraction of a whole range of different kinds of minerals. This region is also has a heavy presence as well of a whole series of different armed actors. Those armed actors including, of course, the national military, but also the operation as well of the drug cartels, of paramilitary organizations, both of which are actually heavily involved in illegal mining, gold mining. Also of more recent formulations of criminal actors, what they call bandas criminales, or criminal bands, or BACRIM, and also other guerrilla organizations that are still continuing in their operations. As you're aware, there was a signing of a peace accord with the largest guerrilla organization, the FARC, back in 2016, but the ELN, another guerrilla organization, still actually operates in this region of the country. So there's also an issue then with these armed actors, large problems with criminal impunity, and also problems of corruption in this area as well, in terms of government corruption. So what we see here is quite a mess, quite a difficult situation actually, to try and carry out any legal transformation whatsoever. So I think one of the big questions then for us when we're looking at this particular case is, well, what's really going to happen on the ground? Can they really match those, the ambitions of the governance model, the timeline of the governance model, and what does this really mean in a context which is so complex such as this? We're looking at issues of law as well in this project. And here really we encounter also questions around the constitution of the legal personhood of rivers. And this is actually a figure that's borrowed from my colleague from Elizabeth McPherson, to try and show really what we mean then when we're talking about a legal person being something that's quite different from a natural person, at least in terms of its understanding in law. So Western legal frameworks that regulate the management and use of natural resources like water have traditionally focused on the utility that such resources provide to humans, both socially and economically. Such approaches are often described as being propertized or commodified, in which property law concepts are used to set value and to distribute and govern resources used by humans. This stance positions water, like other natural resources, as a resource to be exploited to extract utility for human endeavors via legal and policy frameworks that allocate property and use rights, and these are very often seen as being anthropocentric use rights. This anthropocentric approach to the regulation of natural resources is well embedded, of course, as well in both national as well as international legal frameworks. But now we're seeing a shift taking place. There appears to be an apparent shift, a shift to nature's rights. So unsatisfied with this anthropocentric, human and market-oriented focus, a series of legal scholars, environmental and civil society organizations, indigenous peoples organizations, and scientists have successfully lobbied government to take an ecocentric shift in law and policy. And this actually has a bit of a history. So there's nothing, although these cases that we're looking at are quite recent cases, the idea of nature's rights has actually been around in legal circles for some time and date back, in fact, to 1972, to, in fact, the publication rather of Stone's article, an article that's well known called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And then following on from that, then a whole effort as well to try and constitute an understanding of ecocentric law. So following actually from Stone's article, and in the same year, Douglas J. argued for the standing of natural resources as legal persons in his dissent in the US Supreme Court decision, the Sierra Club versus Morton, in the interest of allowing public interest litigation to prevent environmental harms. Ecocentrism inspired the development as well of what's called wild law or earth jurisprudence, which sought revolutionary change in law and regulation based in the belief that humanity and non-human world and the non-human world belonged in fact to the same moral order. In most Western legal systems, at least those that have developed out of Roman law, legal persons are generally restricted to natural persons, that is to individuals. But sometimes also corporations, and sometimes also we see also the legal person also being attributed here as well to ships and other entities. Giving rivers or other natural features or entities legal personality is intended to provide them with the standing of natural humans. Proponents of earth jurisprudence often contrast human rights to property and natural resources with inherent inalienable rights of nature. However, those arguing for ecocentric laws and policies still use the concept of rights and often specifically also refer directly to human rights to secure nature's protection. So there's some vagary here as well that remains here. There's some contradictions, some problematics that haven't quite been fully dealt with. So if we move to talking about the legal rights for rivers, these problematics also come to the surface. Like a little pun. Legal rights for rivers create new paradoxes in law, allowing rivers the protection of their rights against damage and misuse by humans sits very uneasily with the regulatory systems that are premised on the sustainable development of natural resources for the benefit of humans. Pursuant to these approaches, river territories might be recognized, but planning systems still very much divide off and separately regulate components of the territory. Water resources, plants, minerals, what we find in the actual river beds, the subterranean waters, airspace, etc. Rights for nature are also often dichotomized with proprietary models for natural resource management on the basis that nature cannot be owned, yet legal rights for rivers are required to exist alongside private land titles and water concessions. The biocultural model for the Trato case doesn't really escape this. In fact, and that's very evident as well in the makeup as well of the stakeholders that are represented within the governance models, where you still have very clear private claims being made private title claims being made over sections of the river and also, of course, sections of the river banks. And these coming from different kinds of business, different kinds of industrial interest. So moving to the last point in terms of thinking a little bit about theory, I thought I should touch on really what might be inspiring this move to ecocentric law, but also looking at what the consequences are perhaps of these rulings for also broader social theory. And so here I'm going to touch on these issues of post-humanism and also around issues of indigeneity and perhaps also some thoughts about what this means in fact for understanding indigenous identity, that is. So when we're talking about indigeneity, that's really what we're referring to here, actually. This is actually a picture of the leadership batons of the territorial guardians of one of the communities in this area of the Choco, that is the Mbara Chami community, who have set up in their own territory, have set up their own form of kind of local police force, essentially, that do the rounds of the territory, making sure that there's not encroachment from other communities outside of their territory, but also have a role as well in taking care as well of both the physical environment of their territory, but also the spiritual well-being of their territory as well. So what are we talking here about when we're talking about post-humanism? Yeah? Some of you already know quite a lot about post-humanism already, but I'm going to assume that most of you don't know anything about it at all. So what are we talking about? So in recent years, there's been a series of important trends that destabilize earlier anthropocentric understandings of man's dominion over and separation from the natural world. Work done on the interface between science and technology, society and nature, has enabled an approach that is grounded in the materiality of the sciences, and that asks about different versions of the natural world without reducing them to cultural constructions, religion, indigeneity, and also superstition. Influentially arguing for the scientific accountability to be expanded to include the humans and the non-human, Bruno Latour argues for an expanded reality that is not an alternative reality, that is not bound to the nature-culture divide. Monies, technologies, animals, microbes, and natural resources can all function and come to function as what he calls quasi-objects, that is, things that are simultaneously real, narrated, social, and existential. And that these objects are also things that bend human practices in a variety of ways and constantly act to configure and reconfigure human relations amongst one another. Now, in addition to post-humanist kind of post-humanist theory, broadly speaking, there are also major contributions that come out of a tradition as well within my own disciplinary background of anthropology. So anthropology has actually been interested in these kinds of issues for some time. And so I thought I'd just show you this little figure. It's taken from Tim Ingold's work, Spheres and Globes from 1993, where we see really two different figures which are being shown here. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, figure 2.1, which is essentially trying to make a distinction between two views of the environment. That is, the environment as a life world, that we are within that environment, and then also as a globe, that we somehow see ourselves as being separate from it. And of course, Tim Ingold is referring as well to a distinction that has been formed as well in terms of the development of European philosophy and thinking about the world that came out of the Renaissance, came out of the Enlightenment, and shifted the view to basically seeing the world as a globe, as being separate from us. On the right-hand side, there's also a reference here as well to the 14 spheres of the world, essentially an earlier understanding of the world, of a realm of knowledge and science, and of our place within it. And of course, we recognize when we look back over time in history that there have been multiple ways in which, multiple models in which we have constructed, through which we have constructed our understanding of the world. Now, this is really the basis of what we would broadly speak about as being ontological anthropology. So another significant influence on thinking and practice, both within academia and slowly beyond, has been this idea of the ontological turn in anthropology that has been inspired both by its disciplinary history and also by wider shifts in social theory that have taken place more recently. Anthropology has long been concerned with social and cultural difference, that societies and their practices may reflect other ways of seeing the world, but they also actually see the same world. Now, proponents of the ontological turn argue that this notion, that we see the same world, needs to be overturned. It instead proposes that worlds, as well as worldviews, might in fact actually vary. Ontological anthropology is inspired by the premise that a totalizing Western metaphysics of multiculturalism has been and remains one of the most insidious forms of modernist power. Key proponents of the ontological turn, or also the post-humanist approach more broadly, suggest that we need to rework human-nature relations, to relearn humans not as separate, but rather as a companion species. Ingold, referring, who going on from 1993, who's been seen as very much one of the fathers or architects of this kind of turn within anthropology, together with other anthropologists, proposes the foundation of a more than human anthropology. As Singh has suggested, in this anthropology, we don't just identify non-humans as static others, but learn them and ourselves in action through common activities. Now, an important aspect of that ontological turn in anthropology has been something that has been called Amerindian perspectivism, where indigenous peoples and indigeneity is often seen as one of the models for seeing things differently. This critique of Western metaphysics is premised largely on the rediscovery of non-modern Amerindian cosmology. Known as Amerindian perspectivism, this narrative is particularly associated with the pioneering work of Viveiros de Castro, who is an anthropologist who worked largely in Amazon territory. It is argued by Viveiros de Castro and others that Amerindian ontology is the opposite of Western European mononaturalist philosophy and the binaries of nature culture, the separation between nature culture, on which modern ontology has been based. A commonly cited summary of this perspective is that Amerindian multinaturalism may inspire us to invert the entire edifice of modernity by imagining not one world, but multiple worlds, not one nature and multiple cultures, but one single culture, multiple natures, one epistemology, multiple ontologies. So by multinaturalist, Viveiros de Castro means to make us aware that humans share the same culture, soul or perspective, but differ across the bodies that they possess and also the worlds that they perceive, so that we're not actually seeing the same world, according to this perspective. Amerindians, he suggests, are not culturally relative. For them, all humans share the same culture and view of the world. They are naturally relative, for not all humans share the same body in the same world. So if we move this back to talking about rivers and about river rights or the subject rights of rivers, we also have to then start considering also whether this theory informs what is occurring and also whether these rulings also can inform social theory. And so that's really what we're trying to explore in this project as well. This is one of the elements that we're trying to look at. And so we have to look at then how as well, if we take seriously this ontological turn and this Amerindian perspectivism, what is this really, how does this play out in these kinds of cases? So there's a lot of scholarly and policy related writing that describe the cultural relationships with water held by indigenous peoples, often involving deep spiritual and ancestral connections between people and resources, and an obligation on people to govern and care for the environment rather than just exploit it for their personal gain. It is to be a shared world. This portrayal as the more focused literature on indigenous politics and also on indigeneity or on indigenous identity reveals is, however, somewhat at odds with indigenous people's own demands for water rights. And that's a curious thing. Although indigenous peoples emphasize difference and a holistic view of the natural environment, they have very strong eco-philosophies, we might say, they do not necessarily restrict land or resource relationships to particular sorts of use. Indigenous water claims often emphasize a desire for access to or ownership of water for a range of purposes, certainly including the management and use of water for cultural, spiritual, and environmental ends, but also not at the expense of a substantive allocation for commercial use. And so there's quite a pragmatic understanding as well of the access and use of water resources. And so just a last comment here in terms of constructing the indigenous environment. Erin O'Donnell, who's a comparative legal scholar, and again, also one of the main voices on the rights of rivers, has argued that constructing the environment as a legal subject, although it brings a suite of new legal powers and is often necessary to support significant improvements in environmental outcomes in the context of water rights and water markets, can undermine the cultural narrative that considers the environment worthy of protection at all. It's recognized by O'Donnell, as well as my colleague Elizabeth McPherson, that legal rights for rivers are not tantamount to Indigenous rights. And against huge variance, there's a huge variance between and within Indigenous communities as to what they really want here. And they may not in every case represent what Indigenous peoples want. Legal pluralists argue that recognition mechanisms do not preserve Indigenous law or Indigenous jurisdictions in their pristine pre-colonial state. There's an inevitable process of accommodation that recognizes also Indigenous interests. They become what we might call mediated rights. As a consequence, state laws that provide for Indigenous rights are often accused of translating, transforming, and also essentializing Indigenous interests in order to accommodate them within state law, and failing to account for the continually changing state of Indigenous law itself. Indigenous law, like any other legal system, is something that transforms over time. It is not static. So where states declare rivers to be legal persons, they may be recognizing and accommodating Indigenous relationships all the time while mediating and limiting Indigenous jurisdictions. And so this is one of the contradictions, but also one of the problematics that surrounds these cases of river rights. So I've said a little then about politics, law, and also social theory. I hope that has been of interest to you. I have one remaining slide, and that is just to encourage you, if you're interested, to look and find out more and follow us as well in this project effort. We have now formed a website for the project called Riverine Rights. It can be found on Oslo with a connection to Oslo Met. We also have a Facebook page. We have a Twitter site. We have a LinkedIn, whatever you call it, a profile. I don't know. The possibilities to follow us are endless. So please do follow us should you desire and have interest. For now, I think I'm going to switch off from sharing screen and hopefully return to maybe some comments or questions from you guys as well. I'm going to take a question from Melanie. Hi, Melanie. And then Noah. I can't hear you guys.
Can't. You still can't hear me. There we go. Okay, that should be better. Thanks, John. That was really a fabulous presentation. And thanks for letting me take the first question, because I have to sprint off before you get too much further.
Yeah.
So you talked a lot in the Atrato case about how that region or the watershed had a very high percentage of Indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. And you were also really attentive throughout the presentation to how this sort of intersects with different kinds of subjectivities and rights that Indigenous people both have and are allocated by the state. But I wondered whether, since you only talked about that one, or mostly about that one particular case, I wondered if that was the case with in other instances where rights of rivers or earth jurisprudence more broadly is being applied. Like, are they all areas that are kind of dominated by Indigenous people or people who would have been seen as sort of colonial subjects, or, yeah.
So in the case of Colombia, yes. If we look more globally speaking, no is the answer. But I mean, in many yes, but many no. So the circumstances are actually quite different. So one of the common things between the Wanganea case and the Atrato case is they both very clearly have at base Indigenous communities that are forwarding these, that are pushing these legal cases. But if we come to a context such as India, that's not the case. In India, it's not an Indigenous population, but rather it is actually more religious. There are religious or spiritual ideas which are more sort of more commonly shared actually within the Indian population that lie at base within those concerns for those cases in India.
Interesting.
And I mean, so I would just say that a lot we're finding out that there are actually quite major differences in terms of the context actually. that what is a common element is a kind of a concern with on the one hand, of course, the protection of the environment, but also there is a kind of a level of spirituality that drives this as well. There are different belief systems, all right? So with an emphasis on difference, there are different belief systems which are pushing these court cases.
Interesting, really fascinating. That'll make for a very interesting comparative study then, I think, between the cases that you're looking at. Thanks, John.
Extremely rich, yeah. Noah?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic. Thanks for sharing. I wonder if the project itself has like a, I don't know, a component of like projecting some trajectories, or what could happen like with this sort of legal adventure, because I was just like imagining that to recognize this like non-human entities as subjects of rights could eventually, I mean, to put it very simply, in a simple way, I could imagine that in some cases it might derive into a kind of sacralization of nature, which I think could match more with some claims or some ideas about the growth and this kind of thinking.
Sure.
Or it could also be, I can imagine also that these adventures could also derive into a novel opportunity to commodify the non-human entity, and that this second like idea comes to me with like some criticisms I've heard by some scholars that belong to this like second wave liberation philosophy school, which is somewhat popular in Mexico.
Yeah.
What I've heard is that they point out that like the problem is that like if we recognize that non-human entities have some kind of subjectivity, like then to recognize that subjectivity is something that can only be realized if our own subjectivity can interpolate or have a dialogue with the other subjectivity. Otherwise, that other will always need a human face, and then the problem becomes like, who's going to be the voice or the human face of that entity, which we recognize it has some kind of subjectivity, and then it becomes like the classical political ecology question. So I don't know if the project has some like a methodology or some idea of how to make this kind of projections, or is it just like a more like a follow-up of the development of these legal enterprises?
I mean, I think starting this project, I mean, we're aware of you know, both the possibilities that can be formed out of these legal cases in terms of protections, in terms of the inspiration of other ways of thinking about development, actually more broadly speaking, in terms of you know, development as with a kind of a concern about the world, about the planet, about nature. But we also see that there are a lot of dangers, and there are clearly ways in which also these rulings can be manipulated by commercial interests in different ways. I mean, here there's an emphasis on, you know, suddenly it's no longer, the models of governance are not just about, you know, creating a governance model for protecting the most vulnerable. All of these, what we're seeing are actually models of governance which are, yes, including those vulnerable populations, but also including commercial interests as well, who are considered also to be relevant stakeholders in those local contexts. So there are possible dangers where we end up, you know, with the rivers being, you know, delineated, where there are fences or boundaries placed around, so that people find, in fact, that their access to the water and to those rivers being constricted, being controlled, and where basically the very kind of interest that they started with, which was, you know, to guarantee their access to the river and the protection of the river because of its importance to them in terms of their livelihoods and their spirituality, that in fact actually ends up being limited, being controlled. So we see that there are these dilemmas there, but this has to be, I think we have to look, specifically actually, at the context and see what really is happening. But it's very interesting as well that there are very different kind of, in terms of indigenous communities that are sort of involved in these discussions around sort of the rights of nature. There are very different positions that are being taken. So there are some communities, such as those backing the Wanganea case and the Trato case, which are very, see this as an opportunity, see these as a mechanism, that they can make use of. And that are valuable. But we also see that there are indigenous communities that are rejecting this entirely. And so in New Zealand, for example, I mean, the Wanganea case, it's a river that's in the North Island of New Zealand. But right now, there's just actually in recent weeks, there's been a massive court case launched by the Maori population on the Southern Island against the New Zealand state, where they don't want anything to do with river rights. They're not interested in that at all. They want territorial rights. Right? So they're not willing to delineate things down to a river. They want restitution following in a process of decolonization. They want the entire island to be back into their control. So they see actually that these moves for river rights actually is something that actually limits them. And it really isn't what they're interested in at all. So there's quite a significant difference really between different communities. And so I hope that within the course of the project that we pick up on those kinds of issues.
Thanks.
Kirsty. And then Aida, I think.
Okay, hold on. There, you can hear me now, right?
Yeah, can do.
Yeah, good. Oh, thank you, John. This was very interesting to hear about your projects. And I'll be quick with my questions, since there are a few more questions. So my first question that popped up was sort of how will you, I was curious about how you will research this and how you will do this comparatively. So that was one question that I was thinking about, and it was very interesting to hear sort of the ambitions you have and the thoughts you have about how to make use of these various theories that you play around with. So that will also be interesting to follow. And then my second question, now listening actually to Noah, I became curious about how these cases became cases. I mean, how did they end up in the legal system? And then there are a couple of things that interest me. I mean, one thing is like, with regards to, the Norwegian case, which is the one that I know that you mentioned also about the climate case. I mean, there are these issues about, how this is now been pulled into the legal system, and should it actually be politics? And how is that in these cases that you explore here with the Riverine Rights? And then related to that, I was also curious about maybe, if perhaps with regard to Colombia, you could comment on this sort of the power relations that sort of maybe constitute the broader environmental political field, sort of how important is this riverine rights compared to other ecological issues within that particular context? Why is this become juridical? Yeah, some reflections around that.
It was a nice small question.
Yes, very small questions.
3 questions. But right, I mean, no, I'm not. There was quite a lot in that question itself. In terms of, okay, well, what are we doing to carrying out the research? What methodologies are we using? Well, I mean, this deals with law, so there's a lot of case law. So there's a lot of work as well with grey material. So that's the first thing that we're doing, is really working with the legal documentation surrounding these cases, and that we can do within the pandemic. Luckily, right? It's not actually a problem. It's one of the things that we can do, and it's good preparatory work as well for us as well. We're also starting out as well with a series of digital interviews as well with main people within the court cases themselves. So actually digital interviews with the judges, the court clerks, and as well as people who are representatives of these new guardian models. So that's something that we're also working with. But the ambition with the project as well is to also carry out field work in these zones, where, so in these areas surrounding the rivers. I mean, the initial idea that I had was a rather romantic view of drifting downstream, but that's never going to happen. So I mean, there are massive territories really that we're looking at, and so we're going to have to think very carefully about how to actually conduct research, field research in such large territories, and territories where there are major, there are major security challenges and all of that. So we will have to work on that as time goes on, and hopefully the pandemic will end sometime to allow us for that to actually be done. You also remind me now that there was a second part, and I'm forgetting the other parts of your questions.
I guess I should not have a second part, but it was more about the context of how these cases became contexts. I mean, how these cases.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, the cases themselves are really, really interesting. How they come into being, and it's really what's happening is, these court cases are a representation of a much broader kind of juridification of politics that's been taking place actually in Latin America since the 1990s. But really is now also becoming a global thing as well. I have colleagues, over at CMI, they've been working with this concept for some time, this idea of lawfare, where law basically has become the battleground. It's no longer politics, and it's no longer out in the streets. It's actually in the courtrooms. And the courtrooms have become places where these issues are really battled over, and where there are, the major kind of differences, world differences, ontological differences are being sort of sorted through. So this is, and all of these cases are, what's interesting about them as well is that they're not only law as politics, but they're law as mass politics. So they're all sort of class action kind of efforts. They all involve multiple actors. Very often multiple different civil society organizations together with academics, together with lawyers and so on. So they're really quite major efforts. And so the organization effort around that as well, to actually get a court case like that off the ground is quite extraordinary. Actually, it's really, really quite extraordinary. The Trato case itself, I mean, what they did in order to reach that ruling is absolutely mind-boggling, because the way in which the number of actors that were involved, but also the amount of communities that were visited and where there was consultation and dialogue and so on. It's really quite extraordinary, an extraordinary piece of legal work actually, which has gone into that. So it's very, very interesting to look at. You asked also about the Colombian context, about that complex context of Colombia in a larger sense, I think you were thinking about.
I was just wondering about the riverine rights compared to other ecological issues, and why is this issue being juridified, or is it only this, or is it just part of a bigger complex, or how is that?
It's not only this, and I think that's one of the things that we have to be clear about, is that although our focus is on these rulings on rivers, the reality is that there's a lot more legal innovation going on around the edges as well. I was involved in Colombia earlier on with legal efforts surrounding popular consultations, popular referenda. So there are a lot of these. I mean, Colombia is a really interesting environment for law. Bizarrely, in a context of conflict, there's a lot of legal innovation. Okay, Aida.
Thanks, John. It was a very inspiring presentation. I mean, my question is quite practical, and I guess you may have an overview or maybe not. So for me, it was more about the inspiration and how this could be done elsewhere, particularly where I work. So I was wondering if you had a kind of a feeling of, apart from having people with different levels of spirituality, that it could be ethnical or it could be indigenous or whatever is the reason. I mean, how long does it take? Because, I mean, I think it requires a level of organization, self-organization, if we want to call it like this. And also, like, my feeling is that they require international support or expert support, maybe just even national in this case. It's like, you need to have somebody who knows about it. I mean, I'm just thinking, like the Tuareg hunter-gatherers that I mentioned the other day, they would love to claim the rights of the land or the river or whatever, but they're just completely powerless. I mean, how do you even start? I mean, I don't know, I was just thinking about maybe as your project evolves, you can maybe even provide some kind of a paper or an overview of how this works, or how it has worked, at least for your case studies. Yeah. Because I think it might be very inspirational for other settings to learn from this, just the process itself. no matter how successful or where it is at where it stands at the moment, if it makes sense.
We hope it does actually have some kind of broader value, not just an academic value, but some sort of broader practical kind of significance as well. One of the people on our advisory board is a guy called Grant Wilson. Grant Wilson is also the leader for what's called the Earth Law Institute or Earth Law Center, sorry, in Colorado in the United States. And so he's very interested in the project because, of course, he's interested not on the academic, you know, the wonderful kind of discussions around theory. He's kind of interested in about, well, okay, so what does this all lead to, right? What's the value of this? What can it tell us in terms of what works, what doesn't work? What you know, are there elements of the experience from these different countries that might have relevance elsewhere? So that has been taken seriously, and it is a point. I mean, you know, we are interested about having a relevance just out over the academic. But having said that, we also want to be very academic too. We also want to be extremely, you know, we want, I mean, you know, working with people who come from law or from the NGO sector, it's also important to emphasize as well that you will retain a level of criticality. So not everything we come to say will be comfortable for them. Not everything we come to say will be of practical value or use for them either. So there are these things that have to be held on to as well as academics, as a group of academics. But yeah, I mean, there's for people, you know, marginalized communities in Africa, or I don't know, in other places, I mean, picking up the knowledge, the support for this is no easy matter at all whatsoever. But there is an increasing body of international experts who are engaged internationally, who are interested in getting involved in different contexts around the place. And I guess Grant Wilson is one of the people to contact if that's the case.
And if you just had to guess a time frame, I mean, was it a 10-year court case that it started, or was it 30?
The Trato case started actually in, I think it took about 3 to 4 years, the whole thing, all told. Yeah. But many, I mean, we're aware law is a slow process. So,
yes, yeah, no, of course. No, I was just thinking about, in best case scenario, how short could that be? Yeah.
One of the things about thinking about using law as a proxy for politics is that that's one of its big problems, is it takes so long. You know, so if you want rapid change, the courts aren't always the best place to go. Yeah. So it remains actually a good idea to be involved, you know, in parallel to be involved in other political activities as well. Maybe that's one of the learnings that come out of working with social movements as well, is that don't just work on one, you know, with one strategy, work on multiple strategies at the same time, work in parallel. So political strategies still remain to be very important, you know, whether it is through lobbying, pressuring, you know, existing political parties in a particular direction, or whether it's actually going out in the streets and protesting. Protest remains to be one of the things that can get things done pretty quickly, even though the authorities say that it doesn't, it does. Anna-Sophie?
Do we still have time?
I'm willing to hang around, don't worry.
I was wondering,
disappearing as they go, that's okay.
Cool. I was wondering in this discussion both on ecocentrism and the specific cases, if there's any change to responsibility and who is responsible. If you take ecocentrism and I don't know the field that well, but if you take human nature, you could argue that the humans do something to nature and the humans have to be punished in a way. But if you suddenly have this view that humans and environment is sort of one, what happens to responsibility and how is that specifically dealt with in the cases then? And on the other hand, can we then also say rivers become responsible?
Yes, I mean, this is a complex matter. I mean, in theory, what it means is that we become co-responsible, right? That we are, you know, we are, and the river and broader nature and the planet are all responsible together. But the practice of that in law is very complicated. And there are a lot of kind of weird contradictions and difficulties with it as well. Because in theory, it also means that the river could take the human population to court. And there are, you know, and there are some weird things as well. Like, for example, in New Zealand, the Wanganea River has rights, now has recognized rights, but actually there is no recognition of human rights in New Zealand law. So it's a really kind of weird thing that the river has rights, but actually in terms of law in New Zealand, there isn't a recognition of human rights. So so in theory, you know, you could end up with a court case being launched where it was formulated that the human population was damaging the rights, I don't know, of the river itself, and then the river could seek compensation, and that compensation would be then paid to its guardian, its group of guardians in some form or fashion. That hasn't happened yet, but it's a legal possibility, and we're just not there yet. So there are a lot of kind of things that there's a lot that has to be ironed out, I mean, in the actual practice of this. But I think that nonetheless, the theory of it, the idea of it, of co-responsibility, has a major, not only a symbolic value, it has a value, it has a significance for forcing us to think about our relationships with the environment in a new way. Bill, your finger. I guess you're going to be the last one as well, Bill. You get the chance to have the last word here.
There's a wonderful American commentator, Lawrence O'Donnell, who has a show called The Last Word, and I wouldn't attempt to compete with him. But thanks, John, for a very fine presentation of a complex project. And I suppose one outcome could very much be whether or not rights of a river is actually a realistic way to go. What strikes me is scale is really important. And the longer the river, and the more diverse ecologies, the greater the use of the river and the diverse interests in the uses of the water.
Yeah.
And so to expect uniformity is unrealistic. And so therefore one needs very different models of governance. And the contemporary efforts has been in integrated water resources management, which is attempted, you know, through a governance model and stakeholder participation. And it works somewhat in Europe. It hasn't worked to large measure in sub-Saharan Africa. And so I just kind of really wonder about the scale that's involved. And so if you take the Nile River, or if you were to take the Amazon, it's one river, maybe. But how is the issue of scale being dealt with in terms of active and real participation by the people who live along the river?
In terms of, you mean in terms of the kind of the actual operation of the models of guardianship?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in case of the Trato River, the idea is that there's representation from different parts of the river system, but that will never secure, you know, a comprehensive participation of the community. So there are issues with that. For us as a project, the issue of scale is a really big headache. I mean, it's a really big headache because we're 6 people, and you know, and we're covering territories which are just enormous. I mean, the Trato, I said, you know, the Trato is 40,000 square kilometers, but we're also working with the Ganges River and 2 other rivers in India. You know, and the Ganges River is as you're all aware, is a river that's doesn't just run through India. Actually, it runs from Nepal through India and down into Bangladesh. So
is it the same river?
It's enormous. I mean, it really is. And of course, the law seeks conformity. It seeks that, you know, that there is a singular vision that is adopted, and that clearly is never going to really work entirely in practice when we start talking about a river system such as the Ganges. So massive challenges, guys, but very interesting challenges nonetheless. So thanks for your comments, guys.
Can
Thanks,
I just add on your John, can I just say one quick
Sure.
thing? I'm really sorry I got caught up in another meeting, which I should have been finished, so I missed out on the first bit, but I'll listen to the recording. I really enjoyed that you took up the Ganges right at the end here, because I was thinking that I have often both Indian and Bangladeshi students in class. And if you just mention the Farrakhan barrage, they will just get up in arms. You know, so these are very, very complex and contentious issues. So it's really exciting work you're doing. But sorry I missed out on the first part of your presentation.
No, thanks for your comment. Thanks. Cheers, guys. Have a good weekend.